Squeaky chair. I got a WD-40.
Oh, it's not squeaky?
It is squeaky. I have to hit it with some WD-40. I just tightened the screws finally.
Nice.
Got tired of the wobbly arms. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Banned Books Podcast, episode number 169, 8.
I did
7,
everything else, but I forgot to look for that. 166.
166. There we
We
go.
took a week off, right?
I
Yeah.
was going to say, we blasted through that article on justice.
Mm-hmm.
And
As
then
best we could.
that took a while, as best we
did.
could. And then we took a break from all of that. And then thinking, well, what should we do to kickstart the engines again? And we thought, well, Capon or Lewis. And then yesterday I found a quote from Lewis, or I was sent a quote by Lewis that I sent to Gillespie, who then had to go find the entire text, which is 12 pages. And we are definitely not going to read all 12 pages. We're not going to do a marathon, but we are going to read C.S. Lewis. What's the official title of this?
Learning in Wartime.
That's it, Learning in Wartime.
1939.
Yeah, right before the war. Actually, I guess Britain.
Well,
would
for
be
them in
a
England,
little
yeah.
involved at that point.
Right.
They were slightly involved in a conflict. And this, like I said, is a 12-page quote unquote sermon. It's not really proclamation. It's more of a speech than an actual sermon. But yet there's a lot going on in here for this time in history. And Lewis, as he does, because he's a Christian apologist, he addresses a personal matter, and then, what do you want to say? He kind of works his way out from there into the broader conversation about war,
Right.
and about nationalism, patriotism, service to one's country, Christians, and the role of the church, or the relationship of the church to that, how it all pans out in his opinion.
We should probably just retread a little bit Lewis's own history. I mean, he did serve. I'm trying to do it from memory. I don't remember. I know we talked about this last time we covered Lewis, is that he did serve in military.
Yeah.
Right. Was that must have been World War One?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he went to Oxford, he studied at Oxford, and ended up not being ordained, but really serving as in a lay vocation of, like you say, Christian apologist, defender of the faith.
Yeah.
And well respected. I mean, known especially for what ended up being Mere Christianity, right? But it was a series of columns that were just newspaper, short articles, and then they got collected into text. So very popular in that way. Popular in the sense, I don't know how popular he was in his day, but writing for the people.
Right.
I'll put it that way.
He's kind of he's a less provocative Chesterton.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I think a little bit more accessible.
In that sense, absolutely. Yeah.
Chesterton can be intense. Really gets your brain gears going in a way that you can't.
Right.
You get lost in the weeds sometimes trying to figure out what he's talking about.
Joel Hess from Ringside and the Preachers and I were talking the other day, because we might be starting a new podcast, but we're working the kinks out on it. But we were discussing this in relation to not only Chesterton, but a guy like H.G. Wells, Chesterton, and even in our church body, Herman Sasse.
Right.
In that, for Chesterton and Wells, because they're kind of contemporaneous, but especially with Sasse too, in his sermons, I mentioned Sasse is one of the few guys, if really the only preacher I've ever encountered, who can preach church history as proclamation. And it doesn't come, it's not a book report, it's not a speech, it's an actual proclamation, but somehow he has the God-given ability to see and read church history and then preach it into the future. And Chesterton's apologetics and H.G. Wells are similar in the sense of their pattern recognition kind of intellects. They can look to the past, recognize patterns in the past, in past generations, then recognize, okay, this is what keeps repeating itself, so it's definitely going to happen again in the future, but it's going to wear a different mask, maybe a different set of clothes, but it's definitely going to happen in this way. So how do we then reflect on God's word and then reflect on history in such a way that then, looking into the future, we can then reflect on the present tense and go, oh, okay, here are all the ingredients in the present tense, because they've been here before. Right. Again, they might wear a different coat of makeup, but it's the same. And therefore, when we preach, we can actually preach into the future because we recognize there's these patterns.
Yeah. Well, it applies to social criticism too.
Right.
So, like, for example, today, I mean, like this text from Lewis, but if you read, I don't know, like Solzhenitsyn or something, and the critique that he makes of his contemporary setting, like, this sounds very familiar.
Right.
Like you say, there's nothing new under the sun, but you look at it and like, yeah, it wears a different face. And what was a commentary I heard? Well, I thought it myself. I said, look, we've tried this before. We have 100+ million dead in the 20th century.
Right.
So why do you think you're going to be able to pull it off this time?
Right.
Without the same result?
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that the definition of stupidity, is to keep trying to do the same thing over and over and failing?
If you put it in the perspective of human sacrifice, it makes total sense, because
okay. Yeah.
when the conquistas were marching across Mexico, Mexico City was sacrificing tens of thousands of people a week. Like every day, all day, there was nothing but blood running down the steps of the temple.
Because that's what the star said to do, right?
Because that's what they said to do. And so it wasn't necessarily a matter of quantity or quality. It was a matter of, we just have to keep sacrificing virgins until the gods are satisfied.
We'll get it right this time.
We'll get it right. Exactly. And so in a sense, that's the problem with death cults, is it's the belief that if we just sacrifice enough and shed enough blood, the gods will eventually be satisfied and reward us. But what socialism has proven time and time again is, in the end, those performing the sacrifice are the final sacrifice. Because if we think of it in terms of an Aztec or an Incan pyramid, we're going to work our way up the steps until finally there's no one left to sacrifice except the high priests.
That's the head of the snake chasing the tail.
Right.
Just consumes itself.
Or like in socialism, the first people to die in the revolution are the journalists who supported and propagated the revolution.
Been down that road, yeah.
And then the bureaucrats are killed, then the aristocrats are killed. It's the same pattern, and it repeats itself in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in Vietnam, and Thailand, and Laos, in Russia, in China. I mean, over and over, Venezuela, Cuba. It's the exact same pattern, repeated over and over again. And so someone comes along who has no recognition, cannot recognize the patterns, and then says, well, we can do this better.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if it isn't a kind of like Holocaust denial, right?
Sure.
Where you just say, well, we're going to ignore the consequences.
Right.
Yeah. And, or maybe it's possible we even thought the consequences were fair or just, given the need, right? Because, those were the evil bankers or something, right?
Yeah.
However you want to attach it. Then maybe that's the reason why Lewis is so relevant to us, is that pattern recognition, right? Where he's seeing things in his context in 39 that resonate with us today, because these things are cyclical and they keep coming back around.
Is it Voyage of the Dawn Treader where they go to the end?
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to understand this in a kind of fictional setting, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader in the Narnia series, that is what happens in that book, is we see the beginning and the end of everything. And again, in a fictional context, Lewis is recognizing this is the way this has to happen. And this is how it's going to happen. It's like I say, when you read the prophets about the last day, where do they point you? They actually point you to Genesis chapter 2.
Sure.
That the last day will actually be the renewal of all things. And therefore, when Isaiah describes the new creation, it sounds exactly like Genesis chapter 2.
Actually, you could probably run Genesis all the way through, to Malachi, or Chronicles, depending on how you want to, which Bible you want to use.
Yeah.
And you look and you're like, what finally, it doesn't evolve, it actually devolves.
Right.
To the point where you have, basically, an imposter, or almost godless pagan who's running the temple. There's no presence of God in the temple. It's all a sham, right? And then only then, when everything is finally lost, is when God enters into time himself, right? And brings the promise. But all the attempts to bring about the promise by their own, actions or, faithfulness, quote unquote.
I'm working on an article right now for Christ Hold Fast, the 1517 article I wrote about the 2 U's, is that we're always trying to game the system. The old Adam is always trying to game the system. The problem is that the system there's no system outside of the system we're trying to game.
Yeah.
So we're always trying to change the rules, but the rules are already predetermined.
Yeah,
So
like restoring the temple in Israel,
right,
in Jerusalem, that's going to bring about the second coming
right.
or something. You're like,
No matter how many times you play a
sorry.
game, it's always going to have the same outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
The house always wins. So no matter how many ways you look at this, it's always going to come back to Genesis chapter 2. There's no alternative.
Well, it seems like every attempt, it actually gets worse.
Exactly.
We're less successful,
Because you have
not
to
more.
be what ends up happening, I think, is that we become more and more violent. Because like I said, we throw something at the wall hoping to break it or crack it, and it doesn't work, but we think to ourselves, well, maybe I just didn't use enough force.
Isn't the goal then an independence, right? Or
Yeah.
autonomy,
Yeah.
that,
Autonomy. Yeah.
yeah. And so then necessarily, if, I mean, this is really kind of the thrust of what Luther, whatever, Lewis gets after here,
Yeah.
is, that when we live apart from that dependence upon God, from a worldview sense, from a faith sense,
Right.
whichever way, you lose your moorings to the point
Right.
where you now live unto yourself, and that is not going to
Yes.
go well ever.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and we noticed that when we talked about this with the Keller stuff, is that the postmodern definition of justice is power.
Mm.
So when people demand justice, what they really demand is more power for themselves.
That is
And yet,
power exercised outside of authority. Yeah.
right. And we see this in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and how he chooses to build his village with a wall around it and mine the earth for metals. And then Nimrod, the
He makes
first hunter
music
of man.
instruments too, though. He's
That's
the
true. He does make
first.
music
Well,
instruments.
if he had metal and
I was
he's
going to say
making
it's Mad
music,
Max Fury Road. If you want to know what it
it's
looks
metal
like,
music. That's right. Yeah.
just saying, it's a dude playing a flaming guitar on top of a truck as it speeds across the wasteland.
It's cool in its own way.
Absolutely. But we see this over and over again. Then is that with Cain or with Nimrod or in Judges, it's just a constantly escalating cycle of violence that starts off with one person, Cain, and then it just continues to spread in a wider and a wider set of concentric circles. And you see this then with those who are, like you were talking about Eric Schmidt, those who are very pro-globalism.
Before we went on air, by the way.
Right. Before when I was talking about Eric Schmidt and interview that he was doing. But the guys who are, and the women who are very pro-globalist, that expansion of that circle now has contained the globe, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that circle, though, can only be kind of tied off and kind of halted through violence. Because it's one thing to try and get 25 to 50 people to do what you want. It's another thing to get several billion people to do what you want.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a much, obviously, more taxing program or system that you're trying to bend.
I think what they see is the limit to our human capacity and to our next step of evolution. It does have an evolutionary worldview as well. Yeah. The limitation here is the divide of the nations, right? We talked about that, and before we went on air, and it's funny because I mean, I guess the Greeks would call that hubris. But from a biblical perspective, that was the Tower of Babel. They were all had one language, they had one goal, they had one mind, and God says, well, whatever they propose to do won't be hidden from them, won't be prevented of them, right? And you look at the future, the globalist future is effectively transhuman. We're going to transcend our humanity into the next stage of evolution. Like, are we comfortable with that? Yeah, AI, that's right. Slaves to machines, whatever it looks like. Are we comfortable with that? From our perspective, we might, I guess, be considered Luddites, spiritual Luddites, that we're hanging on to this, biblical worldview and this, doctrine of creation that, God made us the way we are, and it was intentional, and it's good.
What's that building in London that's a scale replica of the Tower of Babel?
Oh, they have one?
Yeah. It's like a government building or the UN building or whatever in London.
I didn't know this
until of the Tower of Babel.
Until today's Christian History Almanac, that the Beethoven's Ninth Ode to Joy is the national, basically, effectively the national anthem for the EU.
Yeah.
Have you ever read the lyrics?
Yeah.
Beethoven's lyrics. You're like, oh, talk about godless. Good night.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic.
I'll link them in the show notes.
Oh, Tower of Babel, London. I can't remember the exact building.
Can't even think. The history and lyrics.
Building.
History and lyrics of Ode to Joy. Translation and history. Okay, well, I'll link that up.
But anyways, the point is
Yeah.
that outside of, well, and this is what really then to segue into Lewis, this is what he's addressing, is that you have a guy in Hitler and the Nazi regime who, again, they didn't when Hitler was in the military, World War One, they didn't surrender. And this is then the dividing
Just
line in Germany
effectively what
between,
changed their name, right?
yeah, well, yeah, the military didn't surrender, the politicians surrendered at Versailles, and that is what set the ball rolling to what would eventually become the Nazi takeover
Mm.
of Germany. And so Hitler comes out of that, he separates the Germans from the League of Nations, he rebuilds the economy, he reinstills national pride actually in German people through the economy, through giving them back jobs and being able to rebuild their neighborhoods after they were bombed out and so forth. And then Lewis, on the other side of that, having fought for Britain in the First World War, is looking at from the other side of the channel. And so really what we're talking about in 1939 here with Lewis, it goes all the way back to 1914 through 1918 approximately,
Mm-hmm.
and the First World War, because these two men, in a certain sense, just like Wittgenstein was, who fought in the trenches, Sasse fought in the trenches,
Right.
all these people that fought in the trenches, they kept fighting the war after it was over,
What was
as so many
the,
veterans do.
I mean, what ultimately, overcame the empire, I guess, or whatever you call it, the Reich, I guess, in German, from the First War. Um, what was that? It was the Prussian Empire, right?
Yeah,
Prussian Union.
yeah,
What finally overcame that? How did the Kaiser get overcome? Did he just overstep? Was it similar to Hitler in that way?
Well, you look at the treaty and you look at the concessions that were made by the German politicians, they were stripped of everything.
Hmm.
And the punitive damages that were exacted from Germany in 1918, 1919, there were, well, and then right after that, the World Depression hits,
Oh, that's true.
if you want to believe that, and how that happened. But nonetheless, you have this worldwide depression, you had famine and shortages everywhere. So Germany's already being punished and already being stripped and already been overrun. And then this happens. It's like, what was it called? Berlin Babylon. I think it was a Netflix series set in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s in
Oh,
Germany,
that's right. Yeah.
and about a detective trying to solve a murder. And it's pretty vulgar as far as TV shows go. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but it historically really nails it, in my opinion. Because,
Neo noir
yeah,
television series.
but it
Yeah.
really nails Berlin at the end of the 20s, early 30s. It was the Tijuana of Europe. It was really bad, but only because everybody was just trying to survive. So everybody was doing anything that they could and had to do to get along. That's
Hmm.
how bad it was. So when Hitler comes along and says, one, we didn't surrender, it was the politicians who betrayed us. Two, I have a plan to rebuild the economy and reinstill German pride in their country,
Yeah.
and this is how I'm going to do it. And they're like, absolutely, you can't be worse than these guys who just sit around in Parliament all day arguing with each other about nothing and do nothing.
Make Germany great again.
Right, exactly, because you have desperate people who are just trying to survive, and a guy comes along and says, the problem, and people are like, yeah, you're right. That's how we got in this mess to begin with.
Yeah.
And then he actually starts to provide you solutions by starting Volkswagen and Fanta and all these other companies.
That's right. And the
And he
Razor
rebuilt,
Company too. I forget that one.
yeah, that's right. And he rebuilds the economy, and people are making money, and he basically captures the will of the German people this way through success.
Well, that is the way to do it. I mean,
Hmm.
never mind long-term effect, right?
Right.
As long as in the short term, people have what
Hmm.
they want. They're well fed
Right.
and clothed and
And they're
housed,
willing
and
to ignore the rough edges.
right. Well, you have to. It's
Well,
like,
that's
yeah,
what
there's going to
success
be some
does.
fallout. Our energy policy overall will be great for everybody. Just to use a contemporary
Right.
example. Yes,
Right.
it's true. Like those folks, in central Pennsylvania that rely upon coal mining, yeah, they're
Right.
going to be affected pretty negatively. But on the
But the
whole,
ends justify the means.
yeah, that's the
You
common
can't make an
argument.
omelet without breaking a few eggs.
Is it true?
A few
Yes.
million eggs.
Yeah, just
So
what's an acceptable sacrifice?
exactly.
That's
And
kind of the
that's the
logic.
exactly. And so there's a different morality for people at different levels of society.
Do you think they view everything as warfare then?
Yes.
I think, I mean, that's our language, right? We're fighting wildfires, we're fighting
Sure.
cancer, we're
Right.
fighting COVID, we're fighting you name, we're fighting,
war on drugs, war on terror, war
oh
on
yeah, everything's a
COVID.
war.
Everything's a
Always
war. Why?
big.
Because that's how you mobilize the national will.
Right, but that's also where you can get into acceptable sacrifice. You say,
Exactly.
well, yeah, you're always going to have death and war. Okay,
Right.
fine.
Yep.
So who are we, willing to allow
But you have
die?
to have martyrs. I mean, Hitler had his
Mm.
seven, was it the seven martyrs or whatever? In Nuremberg, he had those pillars set up for the martyrs.
Mm.
And they rallied around that. These men gave their lives so that we could be here today to do this.
Either they're patsies or they were willing. Maybe
Well,
in
that was
their
right. That was a part of the mythology that Hitler recognized. I have to create a mythology because I have to give people a story. Like Steve Jobs said, I'm not selling you the hardware. I'm selling you the why. I'm
yeah.
selling you the story.
Yeah, but he I love Steve Jobs as an example of this. I mean, because it's not so obviously complicated in that it's
Mm-hmm.
bound up in morality and other things.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like I have product and I want to sell it to you. I need you to buy this, right? So
Right.
just the power of persuasion,
Right.
manipulation.
But I need you to buy it spiritually. I
Well,
need
he
it to,
did. They called it. I mean, I was in this what they called the reality distortion field.
yeah, right.
But he was just masterful at it.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, Apple's success today is still just capitalizing on that. They haven't really
Oh, they're totally
innovated much
riding the
since then.
wave that he created.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
well, because it was the iPhone, which is
Right.
majority of their business.
Right.
Yeah.
So to go to Lewis, then
Yep.
this is on page 4 of this essay. We'll post a link in the show notes.
It's there.
Lewis reflects, before I became a Christian, I do not think I fully realized that one's life after conversion would inevitably consist in doing most of the same things one had been doing before. One hopes in a new spirit, but still the same things. That actually, whether he's referring to this or not, this is really the dichotomy of the new man and the old man
Right.
that we would talk about with the simile. Is that, yeah, I am actually doing the same. If I wasn't a Christian, I'd probably still be a dad. I'd still be a father. I'd still be doing what I'm doing. Wouldn't be doing this, but I'd be podcasting. I just wouldn't be doing this kind of a podcast. Or maybe I'd be doing an atheist podcast, I'd be reading this stuff and destroying it. Who knows?
Right. Well,
But
I think, I mean, we talked about that before we went on air, talking about, what do you got worth fighting for?
yeah.
That kind of warrior ethic, which you try to cover in your other show. Not try to, you do. And then, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know that, that you would be, a husband and a father. I think it is kind of caught up, the kind of husband and father you are is caught up in the faith
100%.
necessarily. Yeah.
But I was always searching for something to believe in.
Sure.
Which is why I read Buddhism and Taoism and tried to practice its tenets. I've read the Quran, tried to be a Muslim for a minute. All of these things. I was always, like Lewis said, I think, when I read Lewis shortly after my conversion, in the sense of I came to believe in a God, a higher power, because everybody I knew recommended Lewis to me and I read Mere Christianity, he's kind of, he's semi-autobiographical in Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
I met a kindred spirit for this very reason, like he says here. I'm still the same person I am today that I was before I believed in God 2 days ago or 3 days ago. But now I'm wrestling with the person that I am.
Yeah,
it's
that's
like
good.
I say, I was still a drug addict after I came to believe in God, but all of a sudden now I actually came to believe that being a drug addict was not the best thing for my life.
Yeah, your perspective has changed. That's
right. Yeah, exactly. That my whole view of reality flipped. And what was good now was evil, and what was evil was now good. And those who were my enemies were all of a sudden my allies, and my allies turned out to be actually my enemies. Everything was flipped upside down. And yet, like he points out, I'm still kind of doing the same things. I'm just doing them
right in a new spirit with a new
metanoia.
New perspective. It also, it strikes me that that sense of purpose that people are looking for.
Right.
On another 1517 show, this would be your teacher's show. What's it called? Yeah, the Outlaw God Show. They dug into Isaiah, and one of the comments in there that he makes is that trying to distill things down from the numinous, the spiritual, down into the rational, right? Which is a way of actually divorcing oneself from God, but trying to make sense.
We've done a pretty good job of that.
Yeah. But trying to make sense of the things that you're doing, and they have to make sense to you. No, they don't always have to make sense to you. If they're done, I would say if they're done according to the Spirit of God, right? Like, does love always make sense? Or even peace?
Well, I was going to say, I think actually, my opinion would be that the more we try and make sense out of things, the worse off we are, because I think 99.999% of everything in the world is beyond our comprehension.
Right. If we try to make sense of it, it's going to be by way of the law. right? And of restriction and barriers and,
Little L law most of the time too.
yeah, and yeah, just trying to do the right thing, quote unquote.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, yeah, if you think about the fruits of the Spirit, the way that the Holy Spirit works, in our lives, none of those things actually are all that rational. Peace, patience, kindness, gentleness,
Right.
self-control. Like,
Well,
no,
and
that doesn't.
they're not Christian specifically. Taken at
Right.
face value, peace, kindness, charity, those aren't Christian values.
Well, I think the Christian conception of them should be in that they're not inherently self-interested. We see things called peace, but it's
Right.
largely just, trying to, get an
Well,
advantage over someone else.
the rich young ruler, for example, asked Jesus, how do I get to the kingdom of heaven? Right. And in the pursuit of good, he
Hmm.
thinks that's the pursuit of heaven. And Jesus notes, well, actually, there's only one who's good, that's God. And that to me then is actually the distinction between these two worldviews.
Yeah.
I want what's good. And I know atheists who want what's good. I know people who are Satanists. They're literal Satanists. They want good. They
But
want what's
you
good.
can't get it by pursuit.
No, because ultimately what you're pursuing as far as good, well, one, because we don't have any transcendent moral principles. We can't actually agree on a singular definition of what is good. So we're all going by our own roadmap, which actually carries us further away from each other than bringing us together.
Isn't
And
it
then we
interesting?
meet people.
Because even Paul, like in Romans,
Mhm.
suggests that, I don't think it's a suggestion. It says that we do have an inherent sense according to the
Yeah.
law.
Yeah.
And yet today we look around and like, well, where'd that go?
Right.
Okay, we have it. And then,
Mhm.
but why does he spend 3 chapters on that? Well,
Yeah.
because even then, even having it, it has to be informed by God's word.
Mhm.
We can't even, we don't even know who we are.
Right.
We're that ignorant, dumb beasts that we can't even see what
Right.
we already know in our hearts to be right and
Mhm.
true and good.
And that's the old spirit
Right.
versus the
Exactly.
new spirit.
Yeah.
And that's the wrestling match that we all experience as Christians is we want what's good. And
Mm,
if we're sidetracked, we pursue good outside or apart from Jesus,
yeah.
which in a biblical sense means we turned our back to Jesus
Right.
because it's really the only way you can do it. And then every time you turn back to Jesus or he turns us back to himself, that's the revelation of, oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah.
I thought I had the
Confession.
right map.
We were studying Leviticus this morning with my congregation, and there's all these sins of, what do we call them? Omission, right?
Hmm.
Or not omission or commission, just like you unintentionally touched, an unclean animal. When you
Yeah.
find out about it, then you go and confess, and
Right.
you seek forgiveness through the sacrifice, right?
Hmm.
Receive the forgiveness through the
It's the
sacrifice.
oops, I did it again
Right. But
class.
I was thinking, like, how do you find out that you touched the unclean animal and you didn't
Right.
know it?
Yeah.
Well, you're informed, right? Someone saw you do it. God's
Right.
word said, or
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. You don't realize it until you're brought to that realization. It
Until
has,
someone
and it,
else points it out for you. Yeah.
yeah, it's done externally. That's right.
So, Lewis then continues, before I went to the last war, I certainly expected that my life in the trenches would, in some mysterious sense, be all war. Well, there you go.
Hmm.
In fact, I found that the nearer you got to the front lines, the less everyone spoke and thought of the Allied cause and the progress of the campaign.
Hmm.
And I am pleased to find that Tolstoy, in the greatest war book ever written, records the same thing. And so, in its own way, does the Iliad. Neither conversion nor enlistment in the army is really going to obliterate our human life. Christians and soldiers are still men. The infidel's idea of a religious life and the civilian's idea of active service are fantastic. If you attempted in either case to suspend your whole intellectual and aesthetic activity, you would only succeed in substituting a worse cultural life for better.
Hmm.
You are not, in fact, going to read nothing, either in the church or in the line. If you don't read good books, you will read bad ones. If you don't go on thinking rationally, you will think irrationally. If you reject aesthetic satisfactions, you will fall into sensual satisfactions. There is therefore this analogy between the claims of our religion and the claims of the war. Neither of them, for most of us, will simply cancel or remove from the slate the merely human life, which we were leading before we entered them. But they will operate in this way for different reasons.
Hmm.
The war will fail to absorb our whole attention because it is a finite object and therefore intrinsically unfitted to support the whole attention of a human soul. In order to avoid misunderstanding, I must here make a few distinctions. This is interesting because
Hmm.
definitely applies to war, but I was actually, as an afterthought, applying this to Chicago.
Yeah.
and the murders in Chicago, because I was listening to someone talk who lives there last week was talking. We're numb to the murders at this point. There's so many and they happen every day. You just become numb to it.
Right. And police violence, violence against police
Yeah.
committing violence. And I think the reason is what he's talking about here. Once he got into the trenches, he couldn't think, 40,000, 20,000, 30,000 foot view,
Yep.
which is what we do, like back through the media generally, or through our leaders. We stand back and like, well, we want to withdraw from Afghanistan. It's like, okay, that's, in a broad sense, I think it's probably a good idea. In a very local sense, in Afghanistan, it's like, what does that actually end up looking like?
Do the villagers in Afghanistan appreciate that sentiment?
Right. And what I understand is actually they do. I mean, it's we recognize it's a highly tribal society.
I was going to say, I have a book called The Afghan Campaign about Alexander the Great.
This is it, like you said, it's epigenetic. It's written into their very, like, this is how we live.
I have a biography from a former Marine who received the Medal of Honor for what he did in a valley that Alexander the Great fought for.
Isn't that crazy?
So
doing battle in the same place.
Right. And like we were talking about, that if you recognize patterns and you're wise, you'll say, hey, we're in the same valley building the same road that they've been destroying since Alexander the Great first built it over 2,000 years ago. Maybe we need to take a different tact.
Maybe they don't want a road. Yeah.
Exactly. Maybe they don't want us here. Maybe they like living, because we look at it from our perspective of, you people live in the dark ages. You're a Stone Age society. You don't even have power running into your village. You have to use a generator and you have satellite phones and all this stuff. But did anyone ask, is this what you want?
Yeah. I mean, bin Laden with his television and all his pornography was kind of an outlier in that culture.
At the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I mean,
he did grow up rich in Saudi Arabia, so it's not that
right. Exactly. Right. So
he's down for the cause, but he's not that down.
Yeah. He was using that culture to his advantage. Right?
Yeah. Lenin did it. Castro did it. I mean, everybody does it.
Yeah.
That's in that position of like, we're totally we're down with the cause, of course. I mean, I still need like he says, I still need my sensual pleasures.
Mm-hmm.
I can't be all business all the time.
So thinking about it again, I mean, I love this line that we get down. Well, I think we've talked about it in previous episodes, talking about like COVID response and whatnot too.
Right.
Is to say, really the most appropriate response is going to be a local response. And I mean, highly local, like in our case, husband and wife, doing our research, listening to various experts. I would say I don't only listen to US based sources because
I try not to.
Yeah. We have a pretty highly, politicized and polarized kind of approach. Yeah. It's hard to kind of cut through all of that. So hearing, even though we're in a globalist world, I mean, it does seem like we can, for example, listen to Sweden, listen to Ireland, listen to
Germany, listen to Israel.
Yeah. Israel. Yeah. And try to bring that to bear. By the way, on a side note, when it comes to medical science, I know this from the genetic disease in my family, and that no drug gets approved here in the US, even if it's been highly tested and thoroughly vetted in other countries. The FDA will not receive any kind of non-national medical data.
Yeah.
And approval. We see that with like the COVID virus or COVID that virus thing.
The
vaccine, right? We can't really use a Russian or Chinese vaccine because we don't trust them, just in a national way, but medically we don't either.
Right.
They didn't do the work, at least not according to our standards, which might actually be true.
Well, remember when South Africa started buying AIDS drugs on the open market, and how angry the United States got at them? Remember that?
No.
That was when Nelson Mandela became president of the country, and he's like, "Yeah, at that time, then there was a huge AIDS epidemic in South Africa. It was terrible."
Yeah.
And the drugs were so expensive. They was like, well, we're just going to buy these generic off-brand AIDS drugs for pennies on the dollar. And the outcry from the United States was, you can't do that. And Nelson Mandela's like, yeah, I can. It's my country. Because those aren't approved drugs. Well, what they meant was they're not approved by the USA and the FDA.
Right. Yeah.
We hold the patents for those drugs. So you're going to buy these drugs.
Well, my point was that ultimately, I mean, it has to get really, really local. That you not because we have like necessarily personal autonomy, or not because like national leaders can't be trusted, although you might believe that. Simply because that's life, is that it's parents deciding what's best for their children.
Right.
That ultimately if you take that freedom from them, or that responsibility then too,
right,
they're not going to exercise it.
right.
And now you're in a potentially very tyrannical kind of environment where parents are being told this is what you must do for your
Right.
children, when they're the ones who are most immediately responsible for the care of those children.
Right. Well, and yeah, exactly. And on the other side, I was thinking too, we discussed this over the weekend, but for the congregations,
Yeah.
wherever you may be at, different congregations made different decisions
Right.
about their response to COVID and whether they were going to stay closed until the governor said it's okay to open back up, or what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, how they were going to open up, what guidelines were they going to follow, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And we're still working that out
Sure.
across the board. And yet 1 in 5 congregations closed permanently in the last 7 months because of the lockdown. They were not able to sustain themselves. They couldn't pay the bills, couldn't pay the pastor and minister's salary, whatever reasons. And what I've noted now in September is that those who have been here with me since May 4th and went through everything with me and went through everything with this congregation during the lockdown, they have a very different attitude now come September than the people who are coming back after not being in church for 6 or 7 months.
Right.
And I, as a pastor, it's palpable, the division.
Yeah.
And it's not animosity.
It's not even political either, right?
It's not even political.
No.
It is simply, like he points out here, and this is why I got to this, we've been here fighting. And I even said this to one of my elders the other day. I've been fighting so many battles the last 6 or 7 months that I tend to actually see anything that comes at me as a fight, even when it's not. And I have to check myself sometimes and come back around and go, you know what? Hey, I'm sorry. You know what? You asked me a question, but I took it as an instigation.
No, it's actually just living. You're just seeking the way of life.
Right. And to take that step back and recognize, well, this group has been fighting, but we haven't been fighting for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We haven't been fighting for the church, broadly speaking. We've been fighting for our church, our congregation, like you said, here, locally.
I would say the faith of the little ones, ultimately.
Exactly, 100%. And so it's been, what are we going to do about Sunday school? What are we going to do about confirmation? What are we going to do about adult Bible study and catechesis? What are we going to do about worship? What are we going to do about communion? And we made those decisions together in those moments, like you said, based on our own research and data, asking people that we know that are medical experts, what's your opinion? And then making an informed decision for the good of the congregation as it was at that time, and then into the near, recent future. And then other people come back in as if it's still February, or as if nothing's changed since February. And so you have this front line, we've been holding the line kind of ethic. And it's not like you can just drop that and then move on with life.
No, and that whole time, as we've teased out on the show, and we keep coming back to the topic, but it's still, front and center, I suppose, in our life, is, what's the new data? What has changed?
Right.
What do we know now that we didn't know then? Today,
right.
Surface cleaning is not nearly the priority it was at the beginning, right? Mask wearing changed, actually, kind of midstream, right? For regardless of reasons, it did.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. What else? Lockdown changed, depending on where you live.
Everything, almost everything changed.
Right.
And which adds to the anxiety and tension.
Well, it adds to it, but you're right. The people who come back how many people? Well, I'd say the people who haven't come back, at least in my case, they're still operating under the same presumptions that were set forward in February,
in
March,
April,
and then into April.
Sure.
That this is what is necessary, and it's going to be this way for years. And then they stopped listening. They stopped researching. They stopped investigating. They stopped saying, well, like school reopening, for example. Well, what does the European data show?
Right.
Because they reopened in the spring. Not all of them, but in some countries. Well, so we have wonderful data points there to say, what's the risk of transmission to children, from children to adults, et cetera,
Well, to add that wrinkle, we also have data that's 2 years old on COVID-19 that's coming out.
Yeah, you and your conspiracies.
I know, right? Me and the
if you listen this far, you probably you realize that this comes up in our context. And you have to wonder.
The CDC website a year ago, they're like, absolutely under no circumstances should you wear a mask. And then a year later, they're like, absolutely you have to wear a mask. And then they're like, wait, no, you don't have to wear a mask. And it's like, well, again, science is science. I understand that. But how do you go from a year ago saying absolutely no, no, this does no good, to then a year later going, no, absolutely you must, to then within the same span of time go, no, absolutely no, no. Well,
Well,
some.
that Eric Schmidt interview that
Yeah.
came up before, that's one of the things he mentions, like, don't wear a cloth mask because they're not effective. I'm like, wait a minute. We were told those were effective.
Right.
He's like, no, you have to wear, if you're like on public transit, you have to wear a surgical mask, or you have to wear, better yet, an N95 or a KN95 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Right.
But actually, CDC is saying everybody needs to wear a cloth mask, that those are effective enough. Like,
Right.
so you have these different data points and they
Logical
conflict.
inconsistencies throughout.
Right. Well, and even from people that are probably on the whole, consistent with one another, have the same kind of agendas and
Right.
priorities. And that just throws people into confusion. And I think that's also, we talked about that before we went on air. That's one of the points is, you put people in a position where they don't want to exercise their own freedom towards responsibility, caring for those,
Right.
around them, being responsible with their own health and the health of others that they are directly related to and
Right.
care for. One of the ways to do that isn't necessarily providing the wrong information, but it's providing too much information.
Right.
So that you can't wade through it and you end up just defaulting to what the closest, nearest authority,
Well, I wonder how much it appeals to confirmation bias then at a certain point. It's like terminal velocity where you just grab onto anything for security or to stop your fall.
Yeah. Well, if you're fearful, sure. Why not?
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying is that you'll go towards what confirms your biases. So even if it's been disproven, you'll still go back to it because it's a feeling of security and safety.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike Rowe talks about this on his latest podcast. You know how he does the whole, that's the way I see it is how it is, right?
Yeah.
That's the name of the show, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's the way I see it. Yep.
Yeah. So
Or the way I see it.
he takes another situation that describes, a current situation, and it has all the same parallels.
Exactly.
And he uses that to help you understand the conclusion. So he actually, I don't want to spoil it. Well, okay, whatever. It's
He's a great
COVID.
storyteller.
Yeah, it's worth listening to the story, even if I spoil it. So it's COVID, but it's the parallel is to Jack the Ripper, which is interesting. Just the way that everybody stayed in their home, even though it was very targeted.
Yeah.
They were prostitutes, all of them, all the victims.
In one part of London.
And he had the same MO.
Yeah.
And they had pre-existing condition, quote unquote. They were this and location, right?
And it spread outside of London.
Yeah.
Like people outside of London were staying at home.
That's my point. Yeah. And it spread because fear, panic, it has that kind of transmissibility.
And then it spread to the United States too, because US newspapers because there would be a murder like in New York or somewhere, and they'd say, is Jack the Ripper now on the loose in the United States? Wow. This bears all the hallmarks of the Ripper. And you're like, really? But at that time,
it's one guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But in that time when newspapers were really your only means of like mass communication of data, maybe he fled London and now he's in the United States, and that's why there's no more. And that's exactly, it creates hysteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then everybody could be Jack. See something, say something. Yeah.
Wow. So I think it's a wise, Mike Rowe has actually spoken against kind of our universal lockdown and whatnot. So it shows where he is. I mean, I think he's kind of politically neutral as much as he can be. But he does make commentary on politics. So that's the one we were
a conservative because he believes in personal responsibility and doing a hard day's work. And
okay. So it's called They Were All at Risk. That's the name of the episode. I'll link it up.
I like it. So back to Lewis, I believe our cause to be, as human causes go, very righteous. And I therefore believe it to be of a duty to participate in this war. And again, this is 1939. Every duty is a religious duty, and our obligation to perform every duty is therefore absolute. Thus, we may have a duty to rescue a drowning man, and perhaps if we live on a dangerous coast, to learn life-saving so as to be ready for any drowning man when he turns up. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. People ask that question. Well, why study combat martial arts, or why get your gun license, or why learn how to fight with tactical knives? Because you're going to have to defend yourself and your family at some point. And if you're defenseless, how can you defend them?
And what's the harm of learning it and never using it?
Exactly. Better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Think about, this happens with soldiers, right? That go through even multiple tours and never having fired their weapon. They're like,
Right.
really? Why'd you do
Yeah.
all that training on
Mm-hmm.
how to fire a weapon and when and how and being,
Right.
to have the instinct to use
Right.
it appropriately?
Right.
Because you might.
Yeah. And if you look at the statistical data of how many soldiers actually fire their weapons, it's actually rather small compared to the amount of the regular army
We
that
think it's all like
supports.
Call of Duty, right?
Yeah. So it's actually, but nonetheless, like you said, it's going to be in those moments when you least expect to have to need to use those skills and ability. You're going to have to, and
What do they call
thankfully,
that feeling or whatever that they're just anxious to go out to see combat? And they're like, really? You're anxious? Well, it's because
bloodlust.
something like that. I mean, you just spent. I think you spent so much time and effort preparing for it, and then to never see combat.
It's the ideal of it. That's the problem.
Yeah, maybe
I was
until you
just
get
reading about
into
this
it.
recently. It's the
Yeah.
idea of it. Everybody has an idea of what combat is until they get into combat.
It's like, oh, it's not what I
It's
thought
like
it
when
was.
I grew up around hunters and hunting, and I grew up around guns. And I had this idea of what guns are for, which is for hunting. And I knew people. My dad's a Vietnam vet, and I had other people around me who were veterans of Korea and Vietnam. And I had an idea of what it's like to, hold a gun, handle a gun, shoot a gun, so forth and so on. But then when I was in college and after college, when I was running around with people who hunted people, drug dealers and
Sure.
bad
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
to have a gun put in your own face and be the one that's being hunted, that then changes the way that you view guns.
Yeah.
It's no longer, again, when you're out in the woods and you're shooting at trees because you can't find a grouse and you have a whole bunch of ammunition and you're 16 years old, it's fun. And shooting's fun. And there's a sense of like power, and you're growing up with shooting a gun.
Right.
Then when you have someone put a gun in your face, or a friend of yours has the back of their head shot off with a gun, now all of a sudden it's not fun anymore. And that's why my kids, to this day, it's really difficult for my kids then to understand where I'm coming from. And I have to be careful with this,
Right.
because they haven't experienced what I've experienced. And I don't want to give them ideas in the negative sense that they go out and seek to reinforce and discover the opposite. But be very sober about, listen, this is what I've experienced. And the reason that I'm not really cool with you guys pretending to kill each other or shoot each other with guns is because I've actually seen people be shot, and I've seen people killed with guns, and it's not cool. And
No.
nothing that you think about this is true. It's actually pretty pathetic, and it's really horrific. But until you go through it, of course you have an ideal. Of course. It's like falling in love and getting married and having children.
Right.
When you're growing up, you have an idea of what marriage is and an idea of what parenting is, and then you become one, and you realize that nope, not even comparable, not
No.
even close.
No.
Marriage is hard work, and it's difficult, but it's beautiful. But it's the difficulty and the struggle that actually makes it beautiful.
Well, and you can train for it, I think. I mean, I think you and I try to raise our children.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to
to
say,
be,
hopefully you provide a model.
right. At least provide a model, but to, like, we don't spend all of our time. It's more sublimation or something. I mean, it's
You just
just
live it.
yeah. They observe you, you
Right.
as husband and wife, and they observe and how you interact with them as their children. Of course,
And I'm sure you've experienced this, though, is that you'll say or do something with Anne, and then down the road, your children will say or do something to Anne, and you'll realize,
yeah, that wasn't so. Yeah, no.
they're imitating me. But the difference being is that the way they viewed you doing it is you were being sarcastic, let's say, whereas they were like, no, that's how dad talks to mom when he's angry at her. And I'm angry at mom, so I'm going to talk to her this way. And then they don't understand why mom's mad at them and punishing them when you didn't get punished.
Right.
It's like, there's levels to this game, son.
Right. But the point, to Lewis's point, I mean, we can't only focus on that. We don't. No. There's more. It is part of what we're, or we say it's almost like liberal arts education, right? Where it's very broad spectrum. And then, obviously you try to provide the child opportunity to focus,
Right.
as they have skill or discipline,
but
for something.
Recognize forbidding your children from having a computer may limit them in the future from being able to do a job, just a basic job. They can't even do data entry because they've never been allowed to use a computer and learn how a computer operates.
Right. So you end up doing risk mitigation, I guess. Absolutely. On that as best
we live
can.
Around farms and ranchers. We go to get our eggs. My kids go to the farm. They learn about goats and ducks and chickens and horses and cows and all that stuff. They milk the goats, they milk the cows, they pick eggs, they do all that stuff. They think it's fantastic because they don't see the other 90% of the work that goes into having a farm.
Right.
But yet, are my kids ever going to need to know how to milk a cow? Probably not, but they know. So therefore, if they have need down the road, there's a skill they have.
Well, I mean, when the power grid goes down next month
Absolutely.
or
Absolutely.
November,
I
whatever
don't know
month
what you're
you're in
talking
when you
about,
listen to
Chris.
this.
Crazy
What?
conspiracy nut. I don't know what you're
Oh,
talking about.
I thought that was
I
you.
mean,
Oops.
DHS is preparing for one, and they've announced it, but whatever.
Well, it's in the playbook, so yeah.
They did announce it. They did announce it.
Well, I can't believe
Oh, it's
I
just
just said
crazy.
that. I did.
I know. No, it was fascinating to read in the mainstream media. They're like, DHS is taking steps to protect the power grid from an EMP. I'm like, you're just going to talk about it openly? Like it's not a big deal?
Yeah, why not? I
Like
guess.
the whole East Coast will probably go down. You're like, what? Like that's a big deal, man. Like don't just treat that like it's a page 6 article. That's huge for people on the East Coast, especially with 5 tropical storms, which is only the second time in recorded history that it's ever
Isn't that
happened.
something?
It's
Yeah.
nuts.
Well, I mean, Mother Earth is angry with us.
There we go. Yeah, according to Idris Elba.
No, I was quoting Pelosi, but whoever.
Oh, okay. Same thing.
Did he say it too?
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Oh.
It
Well,
go act.
as if Mother Earth is like some kind of animate, person. It has personality,
It's a
right?
sentient being, and we're all parasites. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Which is the whole argument for
And will listen to
population
us
control.
and do what we tell it to do.
Exactly. Just go outside right now. If you're listening to this, stop, pause, go outside, get down on your hands and knees, and just rub the grass. Just rub it. Talk gently to it. Soothe
Please
it.
grow. Please grow.
Please grow and know that we love you. Like when I'm in my car and I talk to Siri, I always say thank you. And my kids are like, why? I'm like, because when they take over, I want her to remember I was nice to her.
I mentioned that I think in a previous episode, the new show. Maybe we just talked about it. It's on HBO, right? Something about wolves, right? Living with wolves or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Where the robots are raising the last of humanity.
Yeah.
These children, well, not doing so hot at it,
Right.
and they're trying to be emotional beings. These robots,
Right.
which is really.
Isn't that the plot of Battlestar Galactica?
Yeah, I know it's been done before, but we keep doing it because I think we need to wrestle with.
We'll get it right this time.
No, I think it's just
it's like socialism.
It's just it's still on our minds. Like, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Like when the robots try to act well, because it's maternal and paternal, which is what's I think unique about this mother and father.
Sure.
That came up in Battlestar Galactica later on, but well, what about a cyborg, a machine trying to act as a mother, and can it have a maternal instinct? It's kind of an interesting question, and in the end, it just doesn't really go well so far. Anyway, I think 4 or 5 episodes in. So,
well, to be blunt, you really need people that are intellectually capable of carrying that water.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Living with Wolves, by the way.
Going back to H.G. Wells and others, the reason they're geniuses in their field is because they were able to articulate and express these things in a way that the common layperson could read one of their short stories or books and go, oh, I understand why I should be concerned about this.
Yeah.
That makes sense that way. Like you were saying, you listen to Mike Rowe talk. This is the way I see it. Even my kids can listen to Mike Rowe, and these big ideas he boils down into these narratives that illustrate the point so that they understand now, oh, okay.
Yeah, and relatively simple, straightforward, easy to.
And in a very short amount of time. It's fantastic.
You're like, oh, so we've been down this road before. Oh, there it is. It's that pattern recognition.
There it is.
Yeah.
So back to Lewis. Thus we have a duty. We may have a duty to rescue a drowning man, perhaps if we live on a dangerous coast, to learn life-saving so as to be ready for any drowning man when he turns up. It may be our duty to lose our own lives in saving him. But if anyone devoted himself to life-saving in the sense of giving it his total attention, so that he thought and spoke of nothing else, and demanded the cessation of all other human activities until everyone had learned to swim, he would be a monomaniac.
True story.
Mike Rowe's point.
Yeah.
The rescue of drowning men is, what is that? Then, a duty. There's no break there.
Yeah.
Then a duty worth dying for, but not worth living for. This is key because he's going to go much deeper into this in what follows. So let's take a moment here.
Yeah.
Basically, if I devoted my entire life to life-saving, I would become a monomaniac.
You're going to be a lifeguard only.
And all other human activities would actually suffer as a consequence. All my relationships would just be destroyed.
Wasn't that part of what happened in the Sushi with Jiro show?
Yeah.
Wasn't there a little bit about like his relationship to his son?
Yes.
And just how hostile it was.
It was, yeah.
His son ended up
Well,
taking over for him, though, right?
Jiro James is sushi. Thank you. There you
Yeah,
go.
Jirojin.
But his oldest son takes, well, the conceit at the end was that the Michelin stars that were awarded to Jiro, the times that those judges went to his restaurant, it was actually his son who made sushi for them. Jiro wasn't even there. And yet he received those Michelin stars, and he is recorded as being that guy.
Huh.
And his younger son went and started his own restaurant, which is an exact mirror replica of his father's restaurant.
And
To
he
the
was the
extent,
one making it anyway.
right.
And yet,
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating tale because it
yep.
really is the parable of the prodigal son in a certain sense.
Right. But it's also that monomaniac is what I was
It
thinking
really
about.
is.
You know, like when
It
you
really
dedicate
is.
your whole life to one thing,
And
which,
then the only people you can have a relationship with are the people that are engaged in it with you in the same monomaniacal fashion.
or your
That's why
customers
his whole,
at a
well,
very,
yeah, to a
at an
certain extent.
arm's length. Yeah.
In Jiro, it's his oldest son that really is the only person that understands him
Mm-hmm.
because he's with him all the time. He does everything with him and for him. Like
Yeah.
he has no other purpose in life other than to meet his father's genius.
Yoshikazu was his name, the
Okay.
son.
Okay.
Mm.
But the problem then is it destroys everything around you. This is why addiction is so destructive, because
Yeah.
addiction makes you a monomaniac. I
And it's
just got to
hard,
get high.
you know,
Get
and
me
it's
high.
hard to, I mean, he doesn't have a relationship with his father apart from the work. And,
Correct.
there's that question of like, you know, I think they asked the, um, you know, the voice of God in the
Mm-hmm.
documentary asks like, what, you know, do you respect him or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, you know? And it's not even a respect. It's this, it's just that they're held captive by the same
Yeah.
kind of, you know, just passion
Mm-hmm.
that's mono-directed, this monomaniac
Right.
thing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and Lewis, on a side note, but I think it's important, that he's part of the Inkling Society, which is very
Right.
much about being. He's talked about reading books, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being well read, being,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a rounded individual that is, maybe has a discipline, a focus, and yet can also have discussions in other areas. And you know, it kind of bugs me sometimes when people say, "Well, that person, you know, they're operating outside their field." I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, that we can acknowledge that, right? If you talk about, oh, I don't know, like Brett Weinstein, who was the one of the
Mm-hmm.
intellectual dark web guys, he's an evolutionary biologist, right?
Right.
Right, and then he talks politics. You're like, he
Yeah.
shouldn't be talking about politics. I'm like, well, okay, one, those fields aren't actually all that terribly different,
Sure. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, and he has studied he actually more anthropology than biology, right?
I think so.
Evolutionary
Yeah.
anthropology, yeah. That does apply to politics. It may not seem so directly, but it does, right? And yet he'll acknowledge, I don't know everything about, you know, this, and we're going to try this, you know, new thing. Unity 2020
Mm-hmm.
is what it is, right? And you look at it and say, okay, should we disqualify him entirely, or we were talking about vaccines, right? And you have
Mm-hmm.
Robert Kennedy,
Yeah. Robert Kennedy Jr.
right? And so he's a lawyer by
Mm-hmm.
trade, and then but he also was a fisherman, right? It was a, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it was passionate about, the waterways,
Yeah.
and so then he got into that, and then that led him, you know, to other kinds of pollution of
Right.
the human body by potentially by vaccines,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you say, well, he's a lawyer. What business does he have talking about vaccines? It's like, well, does the research and he's litigated cases,
Right.
so, which is part of the lawyer trade. So
Yeah.
this idea that you know, that you need to be, you know, stay within your lane.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the lanes aren't as clearly defined as they are when you're driving. I guess
Right.
that's the way to put it.
Well, we're children of rationalism. We tend to objectify knowledge in the sense of like, well, this is what you're an expert in, and that's it. You stay in your box.
Well, do you need an expert as a lifeguard? You know, maybe at a beach,
All I care about is somebody who knows how to save me.
right? If they can swim and they can come in and they know, you know, how to calm you
Right.
down, you know, float.
Right. I'm just saying, I mean, I don't know, growing up, you were relatively like when in the 90s, for example, I used to watch this reality TV show. Like it was on every week. It was called Baywatch. It was about lifeguarding. And
I'm not going to ask you why you watched it. Okay.
because it was on after college every day. That's why.
No, I thought it
It was
was
on in the
more
afternoon
self-evident than that.
syndication. It was like USA or something like that in the syndication. There's obvious, yeah. Nobody watched it for the swimming,
That part was obvious.
the
Okay.
lifeguarding part of it. But No, it's like, no, I completely lost myself in that.
we could talk about the movie remake with The
I
Rock,
broke
right?
myself. Let's not ever. Let's not ever acknowledge it exists. Why you got to ruin a good thing? I mean, let's be honest.
And derailed.
Exactly. But the point is then where he's going to segue then from this analogy into this broader conversation now, because he starts with himself, reflects on his conversion,
yeah,
discusses the language of vocation and duty, which is actually Kantian, which is a whole other conversation. But point is that now it's the rescue of drowning men is a duty worth dying for, but it's not worth living for. Meaning, if you sacrifice your life to save a drowning man or woman, so long as they actually survive, or maybe even not if they survive, just the intent is there, the motive is good and righteous. It's good because what is my intent? To save that person from death. But you both died. No. It's the intent that matters. It's the absolute commitment to my duty as a lifeguard to rescue that person.
Right.
Now, that being said, then, if you devote every waking moment to basically fear that someone's going to die out in the ocean if you're not out there to save them, it's going to destroy your whole life.
You can't just sit in the lifeguard stand all the time.
Right. Because ultimately, you're not going to be a lifeguard anymore because everything around you is going to be destroyed by this singular pursuit, to the extent that even other lifeguards won't be able to deal with you because, like with Zero, they're never going to be able to meet your standard. And you're going to alienate people, and they're going to be disgruntled, and they're not going to follow you. They're not going to listen to you. And ultimately, you're going to be fired, or you're going to have to find employment otherwise. You're going to have to find your own private beach so that you can lifeguard the way you want every day, all day, that no one will swim at because you won't let them go in the water, because the best way to save someone from drowning is never let them go in the water.
How much of what Lewis is doing here is talking to, these men that are going into battle, and kind of cautioning them from identifying themselves entirely as a soldier,
Right.
So that when they come home, that's the goal is to come home, right, and have a home to come back to, whether it's wife and kids or whatever that is, and is it ever going to be warfare? No. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're not going to be fighting battles when you get back.
With, like my dad and other veterans, is that they keep fighting the war after they come home. It's in their head. It's in their heart.
Well, of course it will be. Of course it will be. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
Is that
without any backstop, without any clarification, this isn't your identity. The war just goes on and on and on without end.
Right. And, some people, like we said, they do crave the battle. They want to get back into it. They re-enlist, etc. But others, I mean, I think the healthy thing is to say that was necessary for a time, but that's not my whole being.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what he's going after. And we've talked about this in regards to pastoral vocation. How many older pastors have lamented to us the way that they destroyed, in fact, destroyed their family by being monomaniacs towards the ministry. But their whole life revolved and was dedicated toward that. Their marriages fell apart. Their kids left the faith, etc., because they lost the first thing.
Happened to Luther.
It did happen to Luther. I was thinking more contemporary examples.
But
yeah, and that's the danger is say your identity. Well, I said well-rounded before, and we mentioned liberal arts, but maybe Lewis is getting to something even bigger than that. It's like your identity is bound up in who you are in Christ.
Exactly. It seems to me that all political duties, among which I include military duties, are of this kind. A man may have to die for our country, but no man must, in any exclusive sense, live for his country. He who surrenders himself without reservation to the temporal claims of a nation or a party or a class is rendering to Caesar that which of all things most emphatically belongs to God himself.
Fear, love, and trust.
Yep, fear, love, and trust God above all things.
That doesn't mean you can't, love your country.
Right. But recognize that is a little L love.
Yeah. It's
and your country can't save you.
It's true. What?
Well, the political party can't save you.
Well, maybe that's one of the advantages to all the chaos that we're in right now, is that we're getting away from, I don't know if we'll ever get away from two-party system. I hope we do. But I don't know that we want to fracture
parties anymore. They're just like these huge tribes.
Well, it's right. We look at it and like, That's not the Republican Party I remember, and that's
It's kind
not
of
the
like
Democratic Party I remember
two
either.
groups of soccer fans leaving a stadium at this point.
Just hope the gates are open, right?
I'm just saying, you look at, you look at the way things are playing out in the streets of so many cities right now, and then you look at a soccer scrum outside the soccer stadium after Manchester United beats Chelsea or something. You're like, oof, oof. Why are we lighting cars on fire again?
This was a
Because we
reference
lost 3-0. I mean, like,
for our
what is it?
listener Eric Brown, who is big time Premier League fan, I think.
Oh, is he?
I'm
Okay,
trying to
well,
talk like I know what I'm talking about.
that's fine. It's just a whole bunch of guys running around in circles all day kicking a ball
And chanting nonsense
and
songs,
falling down
sometimes
and holding
lewd,
their knee and complaining because they're
and
sissies.
profuse amounts of alcohol as
That's
well.
right. I said it. They're sissies.
You'd rather watch rugby? What?
Oh, in a second, I would be. I love rugby.
Yeah.
Australian rules football, it's even better. It's the best. I love it.
But and we were actually reading C.S. Lewis.
Actually, that's a great point, though. So before we leave that,
Mm-hmm.
there's a Greek term called storge, which is actually the fourth love. In Christianity, we tend to teach the three loves:
Oh, right.
eros, philia, and agape. But
Lewis
there's
did.
actually storge.
That's the reason why.
And storge is the love, like that's the love that we have for a sports team or like a celebrity, like our favorite rock band.
Mm.
That kind of fervent zeal, that's blind. And I use this as an example, and to apply to Lewis's point, my son and I were watching New Zealand rugby in New Zealand one day. We had no idea what the rules were. We were figuring it out as we went, right?
Yeah, right.
We immediately picked our favorite team and our favorite players on that team. And without any knowledge of the players or the team or even what the rules were, somehow just in like 5 to 10 minutes, because of the way that certain players played the game,
Mm-hmm.
we're like, this team's the good team. This team's a good team.
Well, because it's so primal.
It is so primal, right?
Yeah.
But we do that by nature. So whether it's two political parties, two sports teams, two bands, people that argue about bands, I mean, we'll argue about anything.
Sure, of course.
But right now, because of everything else that contributes to the present state of our society, everything is turned up to 11 and put on blast. And so you see a lot of people living for a cause, an ideology, a group, a party, whatever it might be, that ultimately is going to betray them. Yeah. Because it can't give them what they need, which is to survive.
Well,
we
and that's
want
what
to survive.
That's what I was going to say. If it's just tribalism isn't a means unto itself. It's not just being a part of the tribe. It's the benefit of being in the tribe. That's the goal.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
You want that life is what you said.
Safety,
right? Safety,
sustenance. Yeah.
Right. And I don't see any kind of, national level political ideology providing what my children need.
Which I think is why there's so much violence and chaos, is because we have a whole bunch of people demanding that the state save them from something that the state can't save them from, which ultimately is death.
Yeah.
In the fashion of COVID, or in the fashion of that party over there, or that politician over there, or whoever it might be.
Yeah. When I was thinking about this at a church level too, and we were talking about congregational, the life of a congregation, we tried to encourage people is to be really engaged locally, right, in your congregation, and do what you can, within your vocation to care for them, and not to look. This is at least the case in my synod district. They did not provide much guidance or direction because they really couldn't.
Right.
And anytime somebody says, well, what does district say? What does synod say? What they're actually saying in part, and this doesn't just apply to COVID, it applies to everything. What they're saying is, I can't take responsibility.
Right.
And I can't do the research. I don't want to. I just want somebody else to tell me what to do.
Right.
Defer responsibility. The problem with deferring responsibility is you're also then, you're going to defer blame.
You're sitting there and waiting to be overrun by the enemy.
Yeah.
You're sitting there waiting
you
to
just
die.
left yourself, weak and vulnerable.
Wide open. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which we've talked about that before. That's why malls are pretty much dead. Well, they've been dead for a long time, but COVID basically was just like,
first the retailers abandoned them.
Right.
And then I think finally now the owners have decided it's not worth trying to maintain the facade
and we're seeing
here.
The same thing with church bodies in the United States now too. It's the same phenomenon.
Well, what's the value of them?
Exactly.
And I only brought this up because it made me think of the national, politic. What's the value of the republic? Because we're in a republic. We're in a republic, whether you're Republican or not, isn't the point. we're a loose confederation of states,
Right.
as we
Very
can
loose
see.
right now. Yeah, but we're
very,
getting
very
there.
loose, right? California may just have an earthquake and end up succeeding on its own, geographically, but
Fingers
geologically.
crossed.
Sorry, friends of California. Yeah. Maybe north from south would be nice.
We love
too.
you, but buy a boat. That's what I'm saying.
Go live on a boat.
No, I'm just saying when it slides into the ocean, you're going to want to float.
But I mean, what are we actually capable of at a national level?
Right.
What are they capable of? I mean,
Not much, actually.
collecting taxes and directing that money towards giving it back in various ways, which is
theoretically.
It's an odd, yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of an odd kind of circle. I
Right.
guess that spend a lot of money on
Which to anybody, I
vaccines.
highly recommend actually doing the research and looking up income taxes and where that started at and originated at and how it became permanent. It's fascinating history, actually.
Oh yeah, the history of the IRS and the Federal
Yeah, and
Reserve.
I hope
Yeah,
that has to do with war, actually, since we're talking about it.
right,
Yeah. It's all tied up together. Which, by the way, goes back to your earlier question: why are we always at war with something? Taxes.
Money.
It's a big part of it.
Yeah, and oil was part of that, at least in
the
the 90s.
petrodollar.
Yeah,
since the 70s. Since
yeah,
Kissinger
well, yeah,
made
especially
the deal,
in the 70s.
which is a whole nother issue about Trump trying to move us off the petrodollar and back on.
So why don't you want fracking again? Oh yeah, so you're dependent on foreign oil. I got it.
Yeah, there you go.
And foreign natural gas.
Don't die for your country or live for your country. Don't live for your favorite sports team. Don't live for your favorite rock band. Just again, because you belong to one and one alone, and that's God.
Most emphatically, as he says.
Most emphatically, exactly.
Yeah.
So really, all of life is a battle then between that dual reality of, inherently you belong to one greater than yourself, and yet you keep making these. This is the history of the prophets, right? You keep making these relationships with things that are not God's, and then you end up prostituting yourself to these people.
Allegiances. Yeah.
But you keep making these treaties, like in the book of Judges. You keep making treaties with people that I told you to kill. What are you doing?
Yeah,
well, I mean, we got.
Why did Ahab marry Jezebel? I mean,
right?
Apparently, probably attractive, but
yeah.
No, but it was political, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always
stand to have great gain, but he then sacrificed, of course. Right. Well, he wasn't all that faithful at the beginning.
Well,
anyway.
And remember, for those of you listening, the root of the word political is polis, city.
People. Yeah.
People, the city. And so it was a city-state society in Greece for a very long time. And I didn't care about Athens if I lived in Sparta, other than when Athens got in the way of me enjoying being a Spartan, and vice versa. But what all that mattered was the polis, the people of Sparta or the people of Athens to the Athenians, to the Spartans, the Ephesians to Ephesus, the Corinthians to Corinth. It was that group of people. They were the polis.
Like the unspoken rule in Rome, that you don't take a weapon in.
Right.
Into the
Caesar
forum.
Figures out, well, wait a minute. If there's nobody else in there with weapons, then if I went in with weapons, I would thereby be in charge.
Paintball guns that shoot rubber bullets? Whatever.
I'm just saying, one of the funniest things that I've ever read is when the senators rebuke Caesar for coming into the city with his army with their weapons and saying, you can't do that. That's illegal. And Caesar's response was, so stop me. Like, that's got to be a hilarious encounter at the city gates. You can't come in here with those weapons. Okay, stop me.
Yeah, right.
Just that moment of, oh, we've been living in an illusion.
Now the politics have changed.
Exactly. And well, we saw how they dealt with it though, right? At the end of the day, they're like, oh, we'll fight fire with fire then.
Yeah, we can do this.
Yeah. So a man may have to die for a country, but no man must, in any exclusive sense, live for his country. He who surrenders himself without reservation to the temporal claims of a nation or party or class is rendering to Caesar that which of all things most emphatically belongs to God himself.
So relevant.
Go study the history of the middle class, by the way, if you understand how that works.
Oh, yeah.
As far as like identifying with a class and the power of that identity, especially since the 50s. It is for a very different reason that religion cannot occupy the whole of life in the sense of excluding all of our natural activities. For of course, in some sense, it must occupy the whole of life. There's no question of a compromise between the claims of God and the claims of culture or politics or anything else. God's claim is infinite and inexorable. You can refuse it, or you can begin to try to grant it. There is no middle way. Yet in spite of this, it is clear that Christianity does not exclude any of the ordinary human activities. St. Paul tells people to get on with their jobs.
Yeah.
He even assumes that Christians may go to dinner parties, and what is more, dinner parties given by pagans.
That's First Corinthians. Yeah.
Yeah. Our Lord attends a wedding and provides miraculous wine. Under the aegis of his church and in most Christian ages, or in the most Christian ages, learning and the arts flourish. So the solution of this paradox is, of course, well known to you. Whether you eat or drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. Wow.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful confession of vocation.
It really is. In the early church, the Middle Ages, the Reformation, post-Reformation, modernity, post-modernity, you can always see when the church abandons justification by faith alone because they abandon this. Because once you abandon justification by faith, what follows from that is the fruit of faith.
Right.
Which would be charity.
Yeah,
by the way, that's how you translate love there. It's charity.
They lose, well, they become dour, I guess is a good word.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Depressing, boring, whatever.
Well, it's like I've talked about before, when you read like the history of the Norse peoples and they're encountering, when they first started encountering monks, their complaint is these people are so, to use your word, dour. Like they're just Debbie Downers all the time. All they want to talk about is how evil and how they deserve God's wrath. They can't enjoy life at all.
Yeah, because they've lost their first love.
Yeah. And so it's not that we don't want to listen to them, even though it's crazy. We're not going to listen to them because they're so just boring and just dour. It's like, why would we want to believe in a God that just waits for you to do something wrong so he can punish you?
So this is contrast, and this happens often in the scriptures, but with the Epicurean approach, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It's like, well, in one sense, yes, eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow you will die, and you will live. In the resurrection. You're not living as if you're just going to die anyway. You're living because you are dying, and you have much to live for.
Right. Yeah. Well, and this is where we get in trouble too. When Paul says, everything's permitted. Everything's permitted, but not everything's beneficial.
Yeah.
And when you're afraid of your freedom, you run away from that statement as quickly as possible.
Oh, of course.
And start hedging your bets and putting up boundaries and throwing up fences. Versus, no, I'm going to live in freedom. I'm going to open my church. We're going to worship. That's the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
And we're going to do it charitably, and we're going to do it for the benefit of those who come to join us for worship, who are brothers and sisters in Christ. But yet, our allegiance is to God's word. We must serve God rather than men. And so we are going to eat and drink the body and blood of Christ. We are going to preach the gospel. We are going to sing, and we are going to pray. And if you don't like it, or you'd like to mandate that we can't do it, get bent, kick rocks.
Yeah. I liked, I can't remember who does this, but some acquaintance, for their Easter vigil, which is kind of I won't say it's excruciating, but it's a little long. It's a long service. It can be very long. Okay.
It's a hostage situation.
It's a little bit of one. But the priority there is like, look, we need to take the time, at least once a year to hear the history of salvation, told narratively from the scriptures, right? But the goal is towards Easter, towards the proclamation of the resurrection, the gospel, and the receiving of the Lord's body and blood. Right. And then afterwards, they have like a champagne party or whatever, champagne and some kind of horses duvers, as my wife's family says it.
Horses duvers. Yeah. Horse. Yeah.
It's like, that we can not only rejoice in receiving Christ's body and blood, now we can enjoy each other's company in another way, right? And I think it's a wonderful kind of contrast, because the first thing's first, right? It's the hearing of God's word, it's receiving of his gifts, and then living out in that. Now, that changes our relationship to one another in a way, right? Or restores it.
I think a very key point is that if we make everything a matter of faith, then nothing is a matter of love.
Oh, right. And well, like the Easter breakfast would be another thing too, though, right? It's like, no, go to church, then have your Easter breakfast and enjoy it.
Right. Yeah. So you destroyed Christmas Eve for people. I destroyed Easter for people by getting rid of the breakfast because it was during the service.
Yeah, exactly. The preparation or whatever.
I would rather sit in the basement and eat fresh cinnamon rolls and have coffee and visit too. However, it's difficult to have a service on Easter morning when all you can smell is cinnamon rolls and all you hear are people downstairs laughing and having a great time, and people upstairs going, why are they not in worship with us?
Right. Well, and all of the cinnamon rolls are a gift of actually Jesus, who died and rose for you.
Right.
So let's let the celebration of that be first. And so, how did he say it? God's claim is infinite and inexorable. Right.
Right.
And you can try to refuse it, but you ultimately won't. But I love that, Jesus loves a good wedding.
Well, it's like we were saying earlier, or I said earlier, at a certain point, you either figure out that you can throw as many bodies at the wall as you want.
Mm.
It's not going to crack. Like, you get absolutely inexorable. Or you're just going to keep throwing bodies at the wall because there's no other alternative other than to just accept defeat.
Yeah,
And
so like we're talking about with communism, but maybe, I mean, it applies to church stuff too. Like, why do we keep doing the same thing over and over? And we
yeah,
have a lot of evidence to show that it's, largely ineffective.
hmm
And I would say almost 100% of the time, the things that are ineffective are
genocidal.
things, genocide. They're not given in God's word.
Right.
That's the
Exactly.
that's the
100% fact.
easy diagnosis. You look at it and
Right.
it's like, why is this fundraiser, this activity that we keep doing, why is it not
Right.
successful? Because it doesn't need to be,
Right.
actually, in the end,
Right.
because it's not
Right.
actually giving faith. It's not, it's not following the Lord's institution.
Right.
So you should be able to take or leave those things and enjoy them while you have them. And then
Yeah.
if they go, they go. And you're like,
Right.
okay, now we'll move on to the next thing. Try another thing.
Exactly.
Enjoy that. Well,
So
and that lack
yeah,
of joy is the thing that really
it
just kind
really
of
is.
bugs me. It's like, if there's no joy in this anymore, and if
hmm
it's not given by the Lord,
hmm
let it go. Just let it
Right.
go.
Yeah.
Move on.
Okay. Good luck.
Hmm.
All our merely natural activities will be accepted if they are offered to God, even the humblest.
Mm-hmm.
And all of them, even the noblest, will be sinful if they are not. Christianity does not simply replace our natural life and substitute a new one. It is rather a new organization which exploits to its own supernatural ends these natural materials.
Mm.
No doubt, in a given situation, it demands the surrender of some or all our merely human pursuits. It is better to be saved with one eye than having two to be cast into Gehenna.
Mm-hmm.
But it does this in a sense per accidence, because in those special circumstances, it has ceased to be possible to practice this or that activity to the glory of God, as you noted.
Mm-hmm.
I think of this too in terms of going back to what you're talking about, warrior ethos and the warrior culture, is that 2/3 of the Bible, and I would actually argue almost the entirety of the Bible, is littered with soldiers, and because they lived in a warrior culture.
Mm-hmm.
And since the Enlightenment, we've kind of leaned hard the other direction and scoured that from our teaching and preaching, and particularly our piety.
Yeah.
And yet, somehow, wars continue, and young men and women serve in those wars, some on the front lines. And everyone is affected by those conflicts in some way, regardless of whether you're involved in them imminently or not. And yet, because we've abandoned the language of Scripture and God's word and how he addresses, let's say, again, going back to Joshua,
Sure.
as a particular example, you have this warrior saint who's leading the people of Israel after Moses. When they were in the wilderness, what did they need? They needed an adjudicator like Moses. When they came into Canaan, they didn't need someone who's going to sit down and basically hear people's complaints. They needed someone who's going to lead them into battle, because there's going to be a lot of battles.
You mean they didn't need a suggestion box?
They did not need a suggestion box in the fellowship hall. And yet then, coming out of Joshua and the death of Joshua and the elders, we see what happens in Judges. There's a
Right.
time of peace, prosperity, and then what happens?
Laxity and
Over and over, they forgot what the Lord did for their fathers in the wilderness. So
it wasn't that
constant.
hard. Just
Yeah.
remember your history,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And yet they forgot.
Of course. Exactly. So you see then, and we do this too then in the present tense, is we try and separate ourselves out from things that make us uncomfortable, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or we don't want to confront about ourselves. And then when someone comes and says, my son's going to join the Marines, and I'm really afraid he's going to get sent to Afghanistan or Iraq, and I'm afraid he's going to be on the front lines, and I'm not quite sure I believe that he's going to go to heaven if he dies. So, Pastor, can he do that and still be a Christian? And I'm like, well, actually, I have this wonderful essay written by Dr. Luther 500 years ago that addresses this point.
Yeah,
Thankfully.
right.
But likewise, the very fact that you have to ask that question suggests to me, or points to me, that we've got a hole
We've
in the
lost it.
ground that needs to be filled.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of biblical texts that we can use to address this. And like I've been told by other people, well, that's the Old Testament, though. That's not in the New Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus tells us to love each other and not to play.
That's not even Jesus himself, who,
Right.
I mean, the early church had no problem seeing his, like Holy Week in particular, as a battle.
Yeah.
as he's entering into the fray
Right.
against sin, death, and devil.
Right.
Right.
So what is it exactly that you're trying to avoid or get away from by saying, well, but that's Old Testament stuff, not New Testament. It's like the imprecatory Psalms. That's where
Right.
that happened. That comment came of, well, that's the Old Testament, though. You can't pray those Psalms in the present tense.
Pray against your enemies.
Yeah, against your enemies, that God would actually crush their skulls in order to rescue you from those who plot to kill you.
One of our brother pastors in California has been praying against his governor.
And I've been praying against his governor too.
Yeah. So, you're like, well, why? Because, I mean, most evidently, I think he's made it very clear he's hostile to the Christian faith. Well, not just to Christian faith, to all faith, but but very much so.
in particular.
Yeah. And that whether you, I mean, it's targeted. And he, of course, he has science to back him up. So, you know, because aerosol transmission when you sing is worse than any other time.
Right.
But but no, that you can't do that. And like, why not? If he's unjust, if he's acting unjustly, you're not wishing him, you know, to have his children dashed against the rocks or something. But the psalmist does for his enemies.
Well, I'll give you a more pointed example. My governor has happily embraced and publicly embraced the tenets of socialism.
Right.
He doesn't he doesn't hide the fact.
No.
And therefore, when I say that my governor is openly antagonistic towards the church, if someone were to say, but he goes to church, I don't care. You can go to church and embrace the tenets of socialism. Lots of people do stuff like that all the time.
Well,
they're wrong.
Let's remind the listeners, as we did when we read, well, what did we read on this? We read a few things. I have to link it. You know, that socialism is inherently atheistic.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Yes, exactly.
You can't be a
socialist to its core. Yeah.
You can't. This is going to make people mad. I mean, you can't be a Christian and a socialist. There's no such thing.
You can't.
They're two conflicting worldviews that do not live together.
No.
Yeah.
Nope. Exactly.
Sorry, listeners. If you'd like that idea, it's not going to work.
No.
Ultimately, Jesus will be the one who you crucify to be a socialist.
And Jesus was not a communist. Jesus was not a socialist. Read the texts again.
Yeah, he actually commends tax paying to Caesar. And granted, it was probably low. It was probably 3% or something. But you know, it was like our gas tax or something. But, you know, still pay to Caesar what's Caesar's.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
There is no essential quarrel between the spiritual life and the human activities as such.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, the omnipresence of obedience to God in a Christian's life is in a way analogous to the omnipresence of God in space. God does not fill space as a body fills it, in the sense that parts of him are in different parts of space, excluding other objects from them. Yet he is everywhere, totally present at every point of space and time, actually, according to good theologians. Is that, he is everywhere, and yet, as we've talked about then, because of our beloved Nagel, we don't need a God who's everywhere. We need a God who is somewhere for you specifically.
Yeah.
And especially then when it comes to what he's talking about, which is going to war. And this is during the Blitz that he's probably saying these things?
39, yeah, probably.
Yeah. The war has come to them already, and Churchill has already spoken to the nation and said, listen, we could all be annihilated here. This is a very real possibility. I mean, people are sleeping in the subways. Most people in London are sleeping in the subways. They turn all their lights off, as soon as it gets dark. There's a real apocalyptic vibe, and everybody is extremely aware of the reality of life. And yet, like Sebastian Junior talks about in Tribe, in the chapter on the Blitz, the number of people left mental institutions to drive ambulances to help people, and the rate of suicide dropped to almost nothing. And everybody was helping everybody because everybody's life was at stake, and it was very real. And then immediately after the Blitz was over, the rate of suicides jumped back up. People went back into mental asylums for different things again. Why? Because that sense of common purpose wasn't there anymore. That shared struggle wasn't there anymore. There wasn't that imminent, this could be my last moment on earth.
That's different than COVID then, because we saw a rise in everything during the lockdown. And I wonder if it wasn't because there was some aspect to people, the threat wasn't palpable.
Right.
It was potential, but it wasn't real. I'm not saying that COVID isn't real, that it isn't a real disease or something like that. But the threat, because like in my case, I know one person, right?
Right.
Who contracted it. There's probably others, but I know one. and he lived, and he's like, well, is that a real threat? Well, it was for him.
Right.
Will it be for others? I'm not so sure. I mean, we still are at the point where the actual like hospitalization, death rate, that we experience in our part of the country, we're not in cities, it's low to non-existent. So the threat is so vacuous almost.
It's abstract.
Yeah, it's abstracted to the point. Then we saw a huge uptick in suicide, because you're also taking away people's livelihood,
right?
Through lockdown, and I just don't know that either the media or our politicians have still to this day presented the threat in a way that that's convincing, right? That's persuasive. It's been done through repetition, but not necessarily.
That's why you see, though, state leaders become authoritarians, petty authoritarians.
Yeah.
If it was a compelling argument and it was an imminent threat to the broadest number of people, we would comply because there's an imminent threat.
Oh yeah.
But because, like you said, it's presented in such a way that it makes people go, well, wait a minute. The only thing you have left then is the threat of force to enforce the mandates.
Well, what I mean is, you say, well, kids have been dying, right? Then you hear that narrative, right? So we can't open the school because kids have been dying. And you're like, well, okay, how many kids have died exclusively of COVID related, triggered symptom? No, it's like 40, but still. Yeah, it was 40 or 70. It's somewhere in that number that the CDC will talk about. We're talking about young children.
Yeah.
And like, it's just like with adults, it's pre-existing conditions. They have pre-existing conditions. Those are kids that should shelter at home, that should be, isolated, because they are at risk, right? Which we knew almost from day one, right? And yet, sheltering people who aren't at risk, they haven't made a compelling argument, but that it's not about making a compelling argument. I guess that's the point. It's about saying, it's interesting with Lewis's article. Now I'm seeing a connection here. COVID's everywhere. It's omnipresent.
Well, like in this state, our governor keeps to this day saying, we're all in this together. We are Minnesota. It's like, no, we're not. You live in a mansion. You'll be fine. People that I know have lost.
Now you're making distinction based off of class. Come on.
Yeah, I am, actually. Because that's what this is. It's class warfare.
Yeah, it's true.
It's not racial, it's class, but we're distracted with the racial stuff, which is why we're being distracted.
We're attaching race to class. Okay.
Exactly. So that we are distracted from the real cause of the problem, which is the people who created the problem are now saying they can give us the solution. And I'm saying we're not in this together. Because like you noted, I have people who've killed themselves. I have people who have destroyed their lives and their relationships through returning to alcohol and drug abuse. People have lost their businesses and they'll never recover. Because unbeknownst to certain people, insurance doesn't actually cover the cost of rebuilding a business.
Well, especially when it's been destroyed by arson.
Exactly. There's a lot at stake for a lot of people. And like you said, locally, you can look at it and go, okay, this has been devastating for us in different ways.
Well, and it's got a long tail. That's the other problem with it. Yeah. We'll be feeling the effects of it. I'd say
at least a decade.
Yeah, at least a decade.
Yeah, at least until 2030.
Why'd you throw out that number?
It just popped in my head. It just
that date that's coming up. You know what state I'm talking about. That date that's coming up. The one I'm talking about.
I don't know what date you're talking about.
I'm quoting somebody.
Google it. Agenda 21.
What? There you went again.
But ultimately, you have the God is everywhere. God fills all of space and time, by the way, with his presence. And yet, that's not a good enough ending theologically for the soldier on the front lines. It's not good enough for those who have lost their business, who have relapsed, who have lost their relationships to a virus that they can't see. It doesn't seem to be like people I train with who have gotten COVID. I'm like, hey, how you doing? I'm good. How was it? Was it bad? I was sick for 3 or 4 days. Like I had a really bad flu and then I felt fine. That's the extent of the people that I interact with.
Yeah,
for them. And therefore, like you said, you look at it and go, I hope I do get it so I can get this over with.
Maybe.
Because it's not that imminent threat. And
I don't know that you can do anything about it. I think that's in the end.
Right. But we want something to be done about it because this is really, I think, the point that Lewis was driving at is that when you get to that point where you look outside of God for someone to save you or keep you safe or preserve you or rescue you or whatever it is, you need the party or the team or
Right.
this individual to save you, whether it's locally in your own home, at your church, in your community, that's a clear indicator you've turned away from the cross.
Right. Well, because you have this illusion of control,
Right.
that
And
you're in control of
I'm not
this.
saying that pejoratively.
Mm-mm.
I'm saying that matter of factly, that anything that is not to live as Christ, to die as gain. And I can confess this, that in the sense of, in order to save my children, I and my wife have taken steps to
Mm-hmm.
protect them
Sure.
from what's happening as a consequence of COVID in the school system and in local politics. Do I rely on them to take care of my kids anymore? No, absolutely not. In fact, they're the enemy of our family, as far as I'm concerned, because of their politics, because of what they're teaching, because of what they want my children to do and what they want to teach them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean then that I look to my wife and I and the local community then to provide for my children? Yes. Am I looking to God? Yes. Do I have divided loyalties? Yes. Because if my children should die, I know I'll see them again in the resurrection. They're baptized. They have faith.
Right.
However, I would like them to be around for a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Yeah.
And therefore, I don't trust the state. I don't trust the teachers. I don't trust the local health experts to have my children's best interest in mind because of the politicization of COVID and other things, socialism in particular, and Black Lives Matter movement. So each one of us in our own way, if we can just take a step back and detach and look at ourselves soberly, each one of us does this in our own way.
Right.
Choosing to homeschool your kids, for example, is still looking away from one authority to another authority.
Sure. Yeah.
It's just a matter of degrees. But you're still basically saying, listen, I don't trust God to take care of my kids over there. So I'm going to do it myself over here.
Yeah.
And
Maybe.
by the way, that might be the most charitable thing that you could do for your children then, is to be like, nope, you come over here. We're going to homeschool because of that. But it doesn't change the bigger reality that the reason then that we seek out the Lord in all that we do and pray to him for guidance, strength to deliver us from temptations, send us a gospel preacher, give us your gifts of salvation, is because no matter where we turn, no matter how charitable, like going all the way back around to where we started, no matter how much I pursue the good and how dedicated I am to pursuing the good for others, by the way, in a
Mm-hmm.
totally selfless way, it's still selfish. And I'm still trying to throw something against a wall and hoping I crack it.
Right.
There's
And
got to be a way I can save my kids from the world.
I think in the end, what Lewis is trying to get at is that that new spirit that he talked about when we
Yeah.
started reading is what takes our selfishness
Right.
and God uses us then, for the
Right.
benefit of others. We
Mhm.
and I think one of the other cautions we have to make is that we often don't see how God is living and active at work in us.
Correct.
Even things that appear to us to be selfish, then He uses for the
Right.
benefit of others. And in the end, well, that'll all be revealed to us. At least
Right.
I want to run with Jesus on that.
Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of all people, said the Holy
Mm.
Spirit usually hides his works from us so that we don't take credit for them.
Mm.
But really, the root of works righteousness, as we call it,
Yeah.
is we actually take credit for the Spirit's work.
Look at I've been a good boy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Little Jack Horner. And so we talked about this, I think, before we hit play. We were talking about Stephen Pressfield and the Warrior Ethos videos that he's doing on YouTube. Is that when the 300 were being chosen by King Leonidas to go and fight at Thermopylae against the army, the Persians, he only wanted men who were married with children. And when
Right.
asked why, he said, because men will fight for their country, they'll fight for their city, they'll fight for their comrades in arms. They'll fight and die for that.
Sure.
But a man with a wife and child at his back, well, he'll take 100 arrows and keep going forward. He will not lay down until you completely annihilate him.
Yeah. It's not
Because
just
he
mind
knows
over body. It's like soul
exactly.
over body.
It is. It's his whole heart. It's his soul. And yet, because he fights like that for his wife and children, he is fighting for the entire city. He is fighting for all Spartans, and therefore he's fighting for all of Greece.
But
But
he's
it
doing it in a
starts
very local,
exactly.
close way. Yeah.
You have to understand that Greece as a concept is embodied in his wife and children, and Sparta as a concept is embodied in his wife and children. And the fight against Xerxes in his army is embodied in his wife and children. I can't have people fighting for an idea. I have to have people fighting for the flesh and blood reality of what this is about. That's what they'll die for, because that's what they live for.
Yeah, and I think we see that, scripturally. I mean, you have the building block of society being the family,
Right.
right? And so Sparta's reflecting that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also see in the history of Israel the way that, that by the time of Jesus, they consider
Mm-hmm.
themselves children of Abraham,
Right.
by blood and not by faith. Not that they're
Right.
defending the faith or they're not
Yeah.
trusting in the promise of Abraham, but simply,
Right.
they're just part of this society.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's another abstraction. You're getting away
Right.
from the point. What does it mean to
But
be a
we're
child of
children
Abraham?
of Abraham, as if that means anything.
Well, it does if it means you trust in the promise that God made to Abraham.
Right. But in a
Yeah.
very real and concrete way.
Yeah, exactly.
God's word as it's manifest right in front of their eyes.
Right. Well, that, but I would even say that they live by faith in the one who is to
Absolutely,
come
of course.
and who has now come. Yeah.
That's why when Gamaliel comes to Jesus and Jesus is like, but I thought you were the greatest teacher in Israel. How do you not know what's happening right now? How are you not aware of
That
what's
seems
happening?
painfully obvious, doesn't it?
Right, yeah. And yet, by the end of the gospel, we here he comes back. Or I'm sorry, Nicodemus, not Gamaliel.
Mm-hmm.
Nicodemus. All of a sudden, Nicodemus comes back around to get the body.
Yeah, quietly, but he's there.
And so, some way, somewhere, the Spirit worked through Jesus in the beginning of that encounter, and then at the end of everything, it's Nicodemus who comes to Jesus by day to get the body. And so something happens there. And so with Lewis, then, whether you're going to the front lines or whether you're going home or whether you're going to your job or whether you're going to school or whatever it is that you're called to do, God is absolute and inexorably there for you in that vocation, in that work, so long as it's done in faith.
As he says, if they are offered to God.
Exactly. So long as they're offered to God, everything is for the glory of God. And
isn't this would be a good, make a good case then for at least, trying to begin or end the day in prayer or both.
Yes.
So that you recognize that this day was a gift to me, the day that is to come, and the day that I've received,
right.
And that if you use Luther's morning and evening prayer, it's that the only way any of this can be lived in faith is if it's done in faith in the forgiveness of Christ, right? Forgive me for where I went wrong, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Without that, well, again, you might boast in your activities and lose sight, sight of the goal of all things, which is that we remain in Christ's care.
Well, and that's why Paul says Jesus is the terminus of faith.
Yeah,
everything that is quote unquote faith finds its tetelestai, its fulfillment, its completion in Christ.
To live is to Christ, and die is to gain.
Right. So in Him we live and move and have our being.
Yeah.
So therefore, in the question of vocation, it's not a question of is this a godly vocation or not. That's the wrong question. But rather, is this done to the glory of God in Jesus Christ?
There is that note that he made earlier, though, just a kind of an introductory caution, is to say, if it can't be done in faith, and there are things that can't be done in faith, then it needs to be set aside.
100%.
Right. But a soldier isn't one of those things.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think that's what he's reassuring them.
Yeah, I think so.
But also on then a meta level or a transcendent level, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, having read a lot of Lewis, this isn't just Britain versus Germany. This isn't just the politics of Britain, democratic socialism, or however you want to phrase it, against the fascism of Germany. This is good versus evil.
Yeah.
Satanic evil. Like, there's no confusion here. This is satanic evil.
Well, just read Narnia, and you see the whole history of Narnia presented that way, as kind of by way of analogy.
Yep.
Is that, no, there's real evil here. The White Witch that we meet in Chronicles, the first book, Lion, Witch, Wardrobe, she was there at creation, disturbing things too. Yeah. Right. This malevolent evil that's been present through the whole narrative.
Yep. See, there you go, White Witch. White privilege. Just
Oh, I didn't make the connection. I drove through Indianapolis yesterday, and there were signs all over the place next to BLM signs that said boycott White Castle. I don't know. What did
in the word White Castle? Or
I guess. I don't know. I was like, what did White Castle do? So our listeners will have to let me know. What's wrong with White Castle?
Yeah, what did you do?
did they fail to stand up? Or I was just like, should it be Gray Castle or
not speak, or
multicolored castles? I think what they should call themselves.
We can't call it the castle either, because that's a symbol of patriarchy and it's a phallic symbol. So just get rid of the whole name.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's
terrible. There's so many levels. Many levels.
But let's stop there, because that's the end of the first thought. And then we're going to get into the second thought, which is about excitement and fear and hope. Is
do
that
that
where
next week.
The trichotomy there is
Oh yeah, it comes
excitement,
towards the end of the document. Yeah.
fear, and hope, or whatever. But
No,
yeah.
it was excitement, frustration,
Oh, okay.
and fear.
There we go. So we'll dive into that next week because we kind of laid the groundwork for,
I think,
that whole point.
Well, and that whether he knows it or not, I think he does. That intersects well with a lot of Lutheran
Yeah.
Ideas. Yeah.
Very good. So thank you as always for listening to, I think, 2 episodes probably at the end of the day.
Yep.
We'll call this episode number 2, and hope you're enjoying this time with Lewis again. I can guarantee you in the near future, Robert Farrar Capon will be making a reappearance. Also, Gustav Wingren. We'll probably
we
dive
talked
into
about
Gustav. We've not read him. Did we read Wingren on Vocation on the show?
No, that was both on previous
So we'll probably have to cover all that stuff because he's really helpful, I think, in both those areas.
Yep.
Maybe use some more John Kleinig in Vocation too. So maybe that's what we'll do. But anyways, thank you as always. Go buy Gillespie's coffee. He's got kids. He needs to feed them.
I got a basement to repair now too.
Oh, that's right, you do. So yeah, he's got a huge renovation project that he must actually take care of, that has been laid upon him by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. a huge cross.
Or bad zoning in the 70s, but whatever.
Oh yeah. So yeah. But as always, we love you, we thank you, and we will talk to you again soon. Peace.